September 23, 1943, Volturno River, Italy. The earth opened beneath Sergeant Reinhold Pabel's feet. Not metaphorically, not gradually. The explosion lifted him 3 meters into the air and deposited him into a shell crater that smelled of cordite, churned earth, and something else. Something copper and intimate that he would later recognize as his own blood. His ears rang with a single high note that drowned out the chaos of the American advance. Through the smoke, he could see his unit retreating, dark figures scrambling up the hillside like ants fleeing water. They did not look back. Pabel tried to stand. His left leg buckled. The pain arrived a moment later, sharp and absolute, radiating from his thigh to his spine in waves that made his vision white at the edges. He touched his leg and his hand came away red, glistening. A fragment of American steel had torn through muscle and lodged itself against bone. He could feel it there, foreign and hot, a piece of enemy ordnance now part of his body. The propaganda films he had watched in Berlin never showed this moment. They showed heroic deaths, clean and purposeful. They showed victory. They never showed a man alone in a hole, bleeding into Italian dirt, watching his comrades disappear over a ridge. He lay back against the crater wall. Above him, the September sky was impossibly blue, unmarred by the war happening beneath it. A contrail from an Allied aircraft drew a white line across that blue, straight, and confident. Everything about this sky spoke of American abundance, the fuel to send planes wherever they wished, the luxury of leaving marks across the heavens. In Germany, the Luftwaffe hoarded every liter of aviation fuel like treasure. The ringing in his ears began to fade, replaced by the staccato rhythm of small arms fire. American voices, closer now. English words he did not understand, but whose meaning was clear. They were advancing, consolidating, claiming this blood-soaked riverbank as their own. Pabel had perhaps 10 minutes before they reached his position. 10 minutes to decide whether to die as a soldier or survive as a prisoner. The choice should have been simple. Everything in his training screamed at him to fight, to save the last bullet for himself, to deny the enemy the satisfaction of capture. 5 years of National Socialist education had taught him that Americans were mongrels, race traitors, a degenerate culture of materialists who knew nothing of true Aryan sacrifice. The newsreels showed American prisoners being paraded through German streets, faces slack with defeat. "This is what happens to those who surrender," the voiceover had intoned. "They lose not only the battle, but their dignity, their humanity." But Pabel's body had already made the choice. His hands were crawling him forward out of the crater toward the American lines. Each movement sent fresh agony through his leg. He left a trail of blood on the rocky soil, a breadcrumb path any child could follow. His uniform snagged on thorn bushes. His helmet fell off and rolled away, and he did not retrieve it. He was no longer Sergeant Pabel of the Africa Corps, veteran of Rommel's campaigns, bearer of the Iron Cross Second Class. He was simply meat trying to stay alive. 20 meters. 30. The American voices grew louder. He could smell cigarette smoke, lucky strikes, the scent unfamiliar and somehow exotic. An American soldier appeared at the ridgeline above him, silhouetted against that impossible blue sky. The soldier's rifle came up, centered on Pabel's chest. Pabel stopped crawling. He raised his hands, or tried to. His left arm would not quite obey, hanging limp at his side. With his right hand he made a gesture he hoped was universal. Surrender. Mercy. Please. The American soldier's finger moved on the trigger. Pabel closed his eyes. He thought of his mother in Dusseldorf, who would receive a letter informing her that her son had fallen in Italy, defending the Reich. She would never know he had tried to surrender. She would never know he had failed even at that. "Medic!" The American voice cut through the moment. "Medic! We got a wounded Kraut here." Pabel opened his eyes. The rifle barrel had lowered. The American soldier was waving, calling others over. 2 more Americans appeared, one with a Red Cross armband, carrying a canvas bag that clanked with metal instruments. They slid down the slope toward him, these enemies who should have been shooting him. The medic knelt beside Pabel and began cutting away his uniform trousers with scissors that looked impossibly clean, impossibly sharp. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, probing the wound, assessing damage. He said something to his companion in English. The other American produced a syringe of morphine from the canvas bag. "Easy, buddy," the medic said. His German was terrible, heavily accented, but comprehensible. "You're going to be okay." Pabel tried to understand what was happening. These were Americans. He had killed Americans, not here, but in Africa, when the war was still clean and distant. He had fired on American positions at Kasserine Pass. He had celebrated when Rommel's panzers broke through American lines. And now an American was injecting morphine into his arm, speaking to him in broken German, telling him he would be okay. "Why?" Pabel managed to say. His voice came out as a croak. The medic looked confused. "Why what?" "Why help me?" The American smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his young face. He could not have been more than 20 years old. "Because you're wounded, buddy. What else would we do?" The morphine arrived in a warm wave, softening the edges of pain, and with it came something Pabel had not felt since the war began: safety. Not the false safety of propaganda, not the temporary safety of trenches and bunkers, but the deep safety of being cared for by people who saw him not as an enemy, but as a human being in need. They lifted him onto a stretcher. The movement sent fresh pain through his leg, but the morphine made it distant, manageable. Through half-closed eyes, Pabel watched the Italian countryside scroll past as they carried him down the hillside. Olive trees, their leaves silver-green in the afternoon light. A stone farmhouse with red tiles. A shepherd watching from a distance, staff in hand, as ancient and unmoved by war as the hills themselves. The field medical station was a collection of tents marked with red crosses, organized with American efficiency into surgical, recovery, and supply areas. They carried Pabel past rows of wounded soldiers, American soldiers, laid out on cots, some missing limbs, some bandaged head to toe, all receiving the same careful attention. The nurses moved between them with practiced calm, adjusting IVs, checking pulses, speaking words of comfort. They placed Pabel on an operating table in one of the tents. A surgeon appeared, already gloved and masked, his eyes the only visible feature. Those eyes assessed Pabel with clinical detachment, seeing not a German or an enemy, but a medical problem to be solved. "Shrapnel in the femur," the surgeon said to his assistant. "We need to go in now before infection sets in. Get him prepped." Before Pabel could process what was happening, they were administering anesthesia. The last thing he saw before consciousness faded was a bottle of plasma being hung above him. American blood, or blood substitute, about to flow into his veins, mixing with his own, making him neither purely German nor purely anything else, but simply alive. Reinhold Pabel had been educated to believe in superiority. Not the crude superiority of schoolyard bullies, but the systematic, scientific superiority taught in German schools since 1933. He had been 12 years old when the National Socialists came to power, old enough to remember a different Germany, but young enough to be molded. His teachers had explained it carefully. The Germans were Aryans, descended from ancient superior stock. This was not opinion, but biological fact, proven by scientists with calipers and charts. The Americans, by contrast, were racial mongrels, their strength diluted by mixing with inferior peoples, Africans, Jews, Slavs, anyone who would come. A nation built on such foundations could never match German discipline, German organization, German will. The textbooks showed photographs. Clean-cut German youth doing calisthenics in perfect formation. American cities with their jazz clubs and mixed neighborhoods. Chaos masquerading as freedom. "See the difference," the teachers said. "See what happens when a nation forgets racial purity." Pabel had believed. Why would he not? Everyone he respected believed. His teachers, his parents, his parish priest, all nodded along to the same truths. To doubt was to stand alone, and what adolescent has the courage for that? So he joined the Hitler Youth, learned to march, learned to shoot, learned to subordinate his individual will to the greater German destiny. The war, when it came, seemed to confirm everything. The Wehrmacht rolled through Poland in weeks, through France in months. The newsreel showed German soldiers victorious, organized, superior in every way to the disorganized rabble that opposed them. When Pabel was conscripted in 1940, he felt not fear, but excitement. He would be part of history, part of the great German resurrection. They assigned him to Rommel's Afrika Korps, and for 2 years he fought in a war that still retained some shred of honor. The desert was clean, the objectives clear, the enemy, the British Eighth Army, were the opponents who observed the rules of war. Rommel himself set the tone, treating captured British officers with courtesy, ensuring wounded enemies received medical care, maintaining the fiction that war could be civilized. But even in Africa, cracks appeared in the narrative. The British had more of everything, more tanks, more fuel, more food, more ammunition. German soldiers learned to survive on Italian rations, thin soups, and hard bread, while captured British supplies revealed a different reality. Tinned meat, chocolate, cigarettes, all in quantities that spoke of limitless resources. They're weak, the officers insisted. Soft. When they meet true German resolve, abundance means nothing. Then came El Alamein. Then came the American landings in Morocco. Then came the long, grinding retreat across North Africa, fighting not to win, but simply to survive one more day. The Americans brought with them a material reality that made a mockery of propaganda. Their tanks were crude, but numerous. Their artillery could fire without pause, without counting every shell. Their aircraft owned the sky. Pabel watched German veterans, men who had fought from Poland to Egypt, stare at American positions with something like awe. The ammunition dumps that stretched for kilometers. The field kitchens that served hot meals 3 times a day. The casualty evacuation by air, the wounded whisked away to hospitals in hours rather than days. This was the army of a mongrel nation? This was weakness? In May 1943, the Afrika Korps surrendered in Tunisia. Pabel was among the lucky ones, evacuated by sea before the final collapse, transferred to the Italian front to help stem the Allied advance up the peninsula. But Italy was worse. The Italian army was collapsing. German units found themselves fighting alone, undersupplied, ordered to hold positions that could not be held. The grand talk of Aryan superiority rang hollow when you were firing your last magazine at an enemy who would simply call in an artillery strike and obliterate your position from a distance. At Volturno, reality and propaganda collided. Pabel's unit, elite troops from the Afrika Korps, hardened veterans, were ordered to hold the river crossing. They dug in, prepared positions, waited for the Americans. When the attack came, it was not a human wave to be mowed down, but a careful, systematic destruction. Artillery pounded their positions for 2 hours. Aircraft strafed anything that moved. Only then did American infantry advance, supported by armor covered by mortars, overwhelming not through courage or superior will, but through sheer unstoppable material superiority. The shell that hit Pabel's position was one of thousands fired that morning, not special, not aimed, just another piece of American industry converted to explosive and delivered with mechanical efficiency. It killed 3 men instantly, wounded 4 others, and left Pabel bleeding in a crater, his leg destroyed by a system that could afford to be profligate with steel. As he crawled toward American lines, leaving his blood on Italian soil, Pabel understood for the first time that everything he had been taught was a lie, not a misunderstanding, not an exaggeration, a lie. The Americans were not weak. They were not disorganized. They were not racial mongrels doomed to failure. They were, in fact, winning. And they were winning not despite their diversity, but perhaps because of it, because a nation that could harness the energy of millions of immigrants, that could organize production on a continental scale, that could project power across oceans, was not weak at all. It was this realization as much as the morphine that made Pabel close his eyes as they carried him to surgery. The world he had known, the world of Aryan superiority and German destiny, had been destroyed as thoroughly as his leg. What would replace it, he could not imagine. Pabel woke to whiteness, not the white of snow or clouds, but the white of clean linens, starched and crisp, smelling faintly of bleach. He was lying in a bed, an actual bed, not a cot or a stretcher, but a proper hospital bed with a real mattress. His leg was elevated, wrapped in bandages that looked professionally applied. An IV dripped clear fluid into his arm. Sunlight streamed through tent canvas, diffused and gentle. For a moment he thought he might be in Germany. Perhaps he had dreamed the war, the wound, the crawling. But then he heard voices speaking English, and memory returned in a rush. He was a prisoner. The thought should have brought despair, but instead he felt only a strange lightness, as if some burden had been lifted. He was alive. The surgery had succeeded. The American doctors had saved his leg, saved his life, treated him with the same care they would give their own soldiers. Why? A nurse approached his bed, a woman, which surprised him. American women serving near the front lines in combat zones. Another thing the propaganda had never mentioned. She was perhaps 30, with tired eyes and capable hands. She checked his pulse, noted something on a chart, adjusted his IV. "You're awake," she said in English. Then, seeing his incomprehension, she switched to heavily accented German. "How do you feel?" I don't understand." "The pain. How is the pain?" "Less." It was true. His leg throbbed, but distantly held at bay by whatever drugs they were giving him. "You speak German?" "A little. My grandmother was from Bavaria." She smiled. "Don't worry. You're going to be fine. The surgeon removed the shrapnel. Clean wound. You were lucky." Lucky. He had been shot by American artillery, left bleeding in a crater, forced to crawl through no man's land, and she called him lucky. But looking around the medical tent, seeing the level of care being provided, he understood what she meant. He was lucky to be here in American hands rather than in a German field hospital, if such a thing still existed on the Italian front. "Why do you help me?" The question came out before he could stop it. The nurse paused in her work. "You're wounded. We help the wounded. It's what we do." "But I am German. I am enemy." "You're a patient." She said it simply, as if the distinction between enemy and patient was obvious, natural, requiring no explanation. "The war is for the soldiers. The wounded are for us." She moved on to the next bed. Pabel turned his head to see who lay beside him. An American soldier, his chest wrapped in bandages, breathing shallowly. On the other side, another German prisoner, unconscious, his arm in a cast. They were mixed together, German and American, enemy and enemy, all receiving the same care in the same tent under the same Red Cross. In German military hospitals, Pabel knew, wounded prisoners, when they existed at all, were treated after German soldiers given fewer resources, regarded as nuisances at best. He had seen it himself in Africa. Wounded British prisoners left in the sun while German casualties were evacuated first. Not cruelty exactly, just priorities. Just the natural order of things. But here, there were no priorities. The nurses moved between beds without distinction. The doctors treated wounds, not nationalities. When the American soldier beside him began to hemorrhage, nurses rushed to his side with the same urgency they would show for any patient. No one questioned whether he was worth saving. No one calculated the cost-benefit of medical resources. They simply acted with the automatic competence of people who had made a choice about who they were and what they valued. Over the following days, as Pabel's strength returned, he observed the machinery of American military medicine with growing astonishment. The supplies arrived daily, trucks unloading crates of bandages, antibiotics, plasma, morphine, surgical instruments. All sterile, all organized, all seemingly limitless. In the German army, medical supplies were hoarded, rationed, stretched thin across too many wounded. Here, the nurses threw away bandages after a single use. They had backups for their backups. A doctor made rounds each morning, Captain Morrison, a surgeon from Cleveland who looked too young to have so much blood on his hands. He examined Pabel's leg with professional thoroughness, unwrapping the bandages, checking for infection, probing the stitches with gentle fingers. "Healing well," Morrison said, his German almost non-existent. He gestured at the wound. "Good. Very good." "Thank you," Pabel managed. The words felt inadequate, incapable of expressing the vast gulf between what he had expected and what he had received. Morrison smiled. "You thank me? I'm the one who cut you open." He called over the interpreter, a private from Milwaukee whose grandparents had emigrated from Hamburg. "Tell him he'll walk again. Might limp a little, but he'll walk. Tell him that." The interpreter translated. Pabel felt something crack inside his chest, some barrier he had not known existed. He would walk again. An American doctor in the midst of war had taken the time to save a German soldier's leg when amputation would have been faster, easier, more efficient, had taken the time to do the surgery right, to ensure not just survival, but quality of life. "Why?" Pabel asked again through the interpreter. "Why do this for enemy?" Morrison considered the question. "Because," he said finally, "this is who we are. This is what we believe in. Every person has value. Every life matters. You don't stop believing that just because someone's wearing a different uniform," the interpreter translated. The words landed in Pabel's consciousness like stones in still water, ripples spreading outward. Every person has value. This was not what he had been taught. The National Socialists had divided humanity into categories: Aryan, subhuman, worthy of life, worthy of death. Value was not inherent but assigned, based on race, on utility, on adherence to ideology. And here was an American doctor stating as obvious truth that every person mattered. Not every German person, not every Aryan person, every person. "I don't understand your country," Pabel said quietly. Morrison shrugged. "Most days neither do I. But we try. That has to count for something." In January 1944, fully recovered from his wounds, Pabel stood on the deck of a Liberty ship and watched Italy recede into the distance. They had been given notice only days before. Wounded prisoners of war were being transferred to the United States for the duration of the conflict. The announcement had caused confusion among the German POWs. America? Across the Atlantic? Why would the Americans transport prisoners thousands of miles when camps could be established in North Africa or Italy? "They want us as far from the fighting as possible," one prisoner speculated, "so we cannot escape and rejoin our units." "They want to hide us," another said, "so the American public does not see the cost of war." Pabel said nothing. He had stopped trying to understand American logic. Their actions made sense only if you accepted premises that contradicted everything he had learned. They treated enemies well because they believed in human dignity. They expended vast resources on prisoners because they valued life. They followed rules even when breaking them would be easier. Nothing in his education had prepared him for a nation that acted from principle rather than expedience. The Liberty ship was new, one of thousands being produced in American shipyards at a rate that defied comprehension. Every 10 hours, he had heard, another Liberty ship slid down the ways, ready to carry cargo across the Atlantic. The Germans had spent years building battleships, each one a masterpiece of engineering, individually crafted, irreplaceable. The Americans built merchant ships like loaves of bread, crude but functional, designed to be disposable. And yet this disposable ship had heated cabins, regular meals, medical facilities. The German prisoners were housed below decks, but not in the hold, in actual quarters, cramped but clean. They received the same food as the American crew: canned meat, fresh bread, coffee. Real coffee, not the ersatz chicory mixture German soldiers had subsisted on for years. On the third day at sea, they were served cake for dessert. Cake. Pabel stared at the slice on his tray, unable to process its existence. In Germany, sugar had been rationed since 1939. By 1943, ordinary citizens received 100 grams per week. barely enough for morning tea. And here was an entire cake served to prisoners of war on a merchant vessel in the middle of the Atlantic. "They're trying to fatten us up," one prisoner joked, "like cattle for slaughter." But the laughter was uncertain. None of them knew what to make of this abundance. It violated the natural order of war. Prisoners were supposed to suffer, to be punished for the sin of defeat. Instead, they were being fed better than they had eaten in years of military service. Pabel ate the cake slowly, trying to understand its meaning. It was dense, sweet, made with real sugar and real butter. Each bite was a small argument against everything the Reich had taught him. If America could afford to give cake to prisoners, what did that say about American strength? If they chose to give cake to prisoners, what did that say about American values? The voyage took 2 weeks, long enough for the German prisoners to adjust to a new reality, to understand that their captivity would not resemble anything they had imagined. They played cards on deck. They read American magazines, Life, Saturday Evening Post, filled with photographs of a civilian world that still existed, untouched by bombing, where factories produced both weapons and consumer goods, where families gathered around dinner tables laden with food. One evening, Pabel stood at the rail and watched the sun set over the Atlantic. The water was calm, silver gray beneath the fading light. Somewhere to the east, beyond the horizon, Germany was burning. Allied bombers were reducing cities to rubble. German soldiers were dying in Russia, in Italy, in France. The 1,000-year Reich was collapsing month by month, defeat by defeat. And he was sailing toward America, fed and clothed and healed, carried across the ocean by his enemies with more care than his own nation had ever shown him. A sailor approached the rail, lighting a cigarette. He was young, perhaps 18, with the open face of someone who had never known real hunger or fear. He nodded to Pabel. "German?" he asked. Pabel nodded. "How's the food?" The question was so unexpected, so genuinely curious, that Pabel found himself answering honestly. "Better than in Wehrmacht." The sailor grinned. "Yeah, we eat pretty good, even out here." He offered the pack of cigarettes, Camels, the image of a pyramid on the package. "Want one?" Pabel took a cigarette, hands trembling slightly. In the German military, cigarettes were currency, hoarded and rationed. This American sailor was offering them freely to an enemy, as if tobacco were abundant as air. They smoked in silence, watching the sun set. The sailor spoke no German, Pabel barely any English. But in that moment, standing at the rail of a Liberty ship in the middle of the Atlantic, they were simply 2 young men sharing a smoke, the war temporarily held at bay by the vast indifference of the ocean. The ship docked at Norfolk on January 19th, 1944. Pabel's first sight of America was a tangle of warehouses, cranes, and railway lines, all functioning with mechanical precision. Forklifts moved cargo from ship to shore. Trains waited on sidings to carry supplies inland. Workers, men and women, black and white, working side by side, unloaded crates with practiced efficiency. Pabel had seen industrial ports before, Hamburg, Genoa, Tobruk. But those ports had been worn down by war, showing cracks and strain. This American port hummed with energy, as if the war were not a drain, but a stimulation, an organizing principle that had unleashed productive capacity beyond measure. They marched the prisoners down the gangplank in formation. Pabel's leg still ached from the old wound, but he walked without difficulty, as Captain Morrison had promised. American military police flanked them, rifles at the ready, but their demeanor was more bored than hostile. This was routine for them, processing another batch of POWs, paperwork and logistics, nothing personal. A crowd had gathered to watch, civilian Americans curious about these German soldiers being paraded through their streets. Pabel braced himself for hatred, for thrown stones and curses. The propaganda films had shown angry mobs attacking German prisoners in the First World War. He expected nothing better now. Instead, the crowd watched in silence. Some faces showed curiosity, some showed contempt, but many showed only a kind of weary recognition, as if seeing in these German prisoners their own sons and brothers, equally caught in the machinery of war. An old woman at the front of the crowd caught Pabel's eye and nodded, a gesture neither friendly nor hostile, but simply acknowledging his humanity. They loaded the prisoners onto trains, real passenger trains, not cattle cars, and began the journey inland. Through the windows, Pabel watched America scroll past. Towns untouched by bombing, houses with lights burning freely, automobiles on roads that showed no signs of wartime restriction. In Germany, gasoline was reserved for military use. Here, civilians still drove, as if fuel were a right rather than a privilege. The train stopped in Washington. Through the window, Pabel could see the Capitol dome, white and intact, no sandbags or anti-aircraft guns. A city at peace, while waging war across two oceans. The disconnect was staggering. A Red Cross worker walked through the train car, distributing sandwiches, thick slices of bread with real ham and cheese, accompanied by apples and chocolate bars. Pabel ate mechanically, each bite further eroding the foundations of his worldview. This was not how you treated enemies. This was not how war worked. "They're softening us up," a prisoner muttered, "making us weak, dependent. Then they'll use us as propaganda." But Pabel was no longer certain. The Americans did not need German prisoners for propaganda. They were winning the war through material superiority alone. And if they were trying to convert prisoners to their ideology, they were doing it through the most insidious method possible, simply treating them well and allowing them to draw their own conclusions. The train arrived at Camp Grant near Rockford, Illinois, on a cold January morning. Snow covered the ground, reminding Pabel of German winters, though the sky here seemed bigger somehow, more open, uncompressed by Europe's ancient tensions. Camp Grant was a city of barracks, surrounded by barbed wire but maintained with American thoroughness. The buildings were heated. The bunks had mattresses. The communal showers had hot water, not cold water rationed by time, but actual hot water available whenever needed. In the German army, hot showers were luxuries granted after weeks in the field. Here, they were daily routine. The camp commander addressed the new arrivals in German, translated by an interpreter. He outlined the rules, work assignments on local farms, correspondence privileges, recreational facilities, adherence to the Geneva Convention. Prisoners who cooperated would be treated fairly. Those who attempted escape would face punishment, but not brutality. The speech was bureaucratic, even boring, exactly what you would expect from a nation that had turned war into an organizational problem to be solved through proper procedures. They assigned Pabel to a barracks with 30 other German POWs, a mix of Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe, most captured in North Africa or Italy. That first evening, lying on his bunk, Pabel listened to the conversations swirling around him. The Americans are soft. They don't have the will to fight. "Did you see the food? They're trying to make us fat and lazy. It's all propaganda. They want us to forget who we are, what we're fighting for." But these protests sounded hollow, ritual invocations of a faith losing its believers. Every man in that barracks had seen the reality of American power. Every man had been captured not through personal failure, but through overwhelming material superiority. Every man was being treated better as a prisoner than he had been treated as a soldier in his own army. Pabel said nothing. He was beginning to understand that transformation could not be argued but only experienced, that the walls of belief came down not through logic, but through the accumulation of contradictions too numerous to ignore. The next morning they woke to breakfast: eggs, bacon, toast, coffee, orange juice. Real orange juice, not reconstituted powder. Pabel sat at a long table with his fellow prisoners and tried to remember the last time he had seen an orange in Germany. Before the war, certainly. Oranges came from Spain, from Italy, from countries now cut off or conquered. Germans had not seen citrus fruit in years. "In Germany, even officers don't eat this well," someone muttered. It was true. Pabel had served under captains and majors in the Africa Corps who had subsisted on the same thin rations as enlisted men, who had carefully rationed their cigarettes and chocolate, who had known that supplies were precious and dwindling. And here, in an American prisoner of war camp, German privates were eating oranges for breakfast. After the meal, they were assigned to work details. Pabel found himself on a farm crew transported by truck to a farm 15 kilometers from camp. The farmer who met them was middle-aged, weathered, speaking no German, but communicating through gestures and demonstration. He needed help with winter repairs, fencing, barn maintenance, equipment servicing. The work was physical but not punishing, the sort of labor that rural people did simply to maintain their holdings. At midday, the farmer's wife brought lunch to the fields. Sandwiches again, but also homemade cookies, lemonade, slices of pie. She smiled at the German prisoners, handing out food without hesitation or fear, as if having enemy soldiers on her property was normal, unremarkable, requiring no special precautions. "She's not afraid of us," one prisoner observed. No, Pabel thought, she was not. And why should she be? They were guarded by a single elderly American soldier with a rifle he never unslung. They could have overwhelmed him easily, escaped into the countryside. But to what purpose? Where would they go? Germany was an ocean away, the war lost in all but official declaration. And even if escape were possible, what they would be escaping from was warm barracks, regular meals, and work that offered dignity without degradation. The farmer treated them with casual respect, showing them the correct way to repair fencing, demonstrating techniques without condescension. When Pabel made an error, the farmer simply corrected him the way one might correct any worker. There was no anger, no ethnic hostility, no sense that Pabel's German identity made him less capable or less worthy of consideration. At the end of the day, the farmer paid them. Not real money. Prisoners of war could not have currency, but scrip redeemable at the camp store for cigarettes, toiletries, small luxuries, payment for work, recognition of effort, a small assertion that even prisoners had economic value. On the truck ride back to camp, Pabel watched the Illinois countryside in the fading light, farmhouses with smoke rising from chimneys, barns painted red, silos standing against the horizon. This was the enemy homeland? This peaceful, prosperous landscape? Where were the signs of strain, of sacrifice, of a nation at war? A terrible understanding began to dawn. Germany was fighting total war, every resource mobilized, every citizen conscripted, every comfort sacrificed to the struggle. And America was fighting a partial war, one that required only a fraction of its capacity, that left the civilian economy largely intact, that could afford to feed prisoners cake and oranges because those luxuries barely registered against its productive capacity. The National Socialists had preached that will could triumph over material reality, that German discipline and Aryan superiority would overcome mere industrial capacity. But will did not manufacture steel. Will did not grow oranges. Will did not produce the endless stream of trucks and planes and ships that had overwhelmed the Wehrmacht on every front. Germany had been defeated not by lack of courage or inferior soldiers, but by simple arithmetic. America was bigger, richer, more productive, and more innovative, and it could afford to be generous because generosity cost it almost nothing. That night, lying in his heated barracks, Pabel faced a truth he had been avoiding since Volturno. Germany was going to lose, not might lose, not could lose, was going to lose with mathematical certainty. The only question was when and how much destruction would occur before the inevitable conclusion. The destruction of belief is not a single moment, but a process, accumulating evidence against cherished certainties until the structure collapses under its own contradictions. For Pabel, that process took months. Each day at Camp Grant brought new contradictions, small but cumulative, chipping away at the edifice of National Socialist ideology until nothing remained but rubble and recognition. The camp library became his education. It contained books in German, not propaganda, but actual literature, history, philosophy. He read American newspapers, translated weekly for the prisoners. The articles were not censored, not shaped by some Ministry of Information. They criticized the government. They questioned military strategy. They reported setbacks alongside victories. This was propaganda? This admission of imperfection, this tolerance for dissent. He read about America's economy. The statistics were staggering, almost unbelievable. In 1943 alone, American factories had produced 47,000 aircraft, 29,000 tanks, 17 million tons of shipping, numbers that made German production look like a cottage industry. And this production came not from slave labor or forced conscription, but from workers receiving wages, unions negotiating conditions, a system that somehow turned individual self-interest into collective capacity. The National Socialists had taught that only total state control could organize a nation for war, that freedom was weakness, that democracy led to chaos. But here was a democratic nation outproducing the totalitarian Reich by factors of 5, 10, 20. How? Pabel began to pay attention to the guards, the camp administrators, the workers he encountered. They were not supermen. They were ordinary people, some capable, some mediocre, some frankly incompetent. They made mistakes. They complained about regulations. They cut corners when possible, and yet somehow the system worked. Orders were followed not from fear, but from habit. Supplies arrived not because planners had perfect foresight, but because redundancy built into the system absorbed errors. Excellence emerged not from central genius, but from distributed competence. This was the lesson Germany had failed to learn, that systems built on trust and delegation could outperform systems built on control and fear. That treating people as individuals rather than interchangeable units produced better results. That respecting human dignity was not just moral but practical. The American guards at Camp Grant were a constant source of amazement. They were not warriors in the German sense, hard men forged by ideology and discipline. They were civilians in uniform, counting days until discharge, eager to return to normal life. Many had been drafted against their will. Some openly questioned the war. None showed any particular hatred for their German prisoners. One guard, Corporal Harris from Tennessee, would sit with prisoners during breaks and attempt conversation through broken German and wild gestures. He showed them photographs of his family, a wife, 2 children, a farm outside Nashville. He talked about his plans after the war, simple dreams of planting tobacco and watching his children grow. He treated the prisoners not as enemies, but as fellow workers caught in the same vast machinery, separated by circumstances beyond their control. "You boys miss home?" he asked once through the camp interpreter. The question was so obvious, so human, that several prisoners laughed. Of course they missed home. Who would not? "Me too," Harris said. "This army business ain't for me. Give me my farm, and I'm happy." He lit a cigarette, offered the pack around. "War's a damn waste, you ask me. We should all be home." This casual anti-war sentiment from a soldier in uniform shocked Pabel. In the Wehrmacht, such talk would be treasonous, punishable by death. But here, Harris said it openly, without fear, and no one disciplined him. The interpreter translated it without hesitation. The other guards nodded in agreement. They did not want to be at war. They did not glory in victory. They simply wanted to return to their ordinary lives, their small ambitions, their individual pursuits of happiness. And because they did not want war, they fought it efficiently, pragmatically, without the emotional investment that led to atrocities. They were too busy counting days until discharged to hate. Pabel began to understand that American strength came not from ideology or racial theory, but from this very ordinariness, this grounding in material reality and personal interest. Germans had been taught to subordinate self to state, to find meaning in collective struggle, to view life through the lens of historical destiny. Americans seemed barely aware of history. They cared about wages, working conditions, family, leisure, and yet this selfish, individualistic society had crushed the communal, ideologically unified Reich. The propaganda had been precisely backward. In March, the Red Cross distributed care packages to all prisoners: chocolate, cigarettes, toiletries, playing cards. The packages came from American civilian donations, organized by church groups and civic associations. People who had never met the prisoners, who owed them nothing, who had every reason to hate them, had nonetheless contributed these small comforts. "Why do they do this?" Pabel asked the camp chaplain, an American Lutheran minister who conducted services in German. The chaplain considered the question. because we believe that even in war, we remain human, that treating others with dignity doesn't make us weak, but makes us civilized." He paused. "And because we believe you're not responsible for your government's crimes, you're soldiers who fought for your country. That doesn't make you evil. The distinction was crucial. The Americans separated the German people from the Nazi regime, soldiers from ideologues. They could fight Germany while maintaining respect for Germans. This nuance, this refusal to dehumanize enemies, was something the Reich had never comprehended. The National Socialists divided the world into categories: Aryan and subhuman, worthy and unworthy, friend and enemy to be destroyed. The Americans divided the world differently: people who agreed with them and people who might agree with them, given different circumstances. In April, news reached the camp of President Roosevelt's death. The guards lowered flags to half-staff. Some were openly crying. The prisoners watched, confused by this display of grief for a political leader. In Germany, Hitler was revered but not loved, feared but not mourned. The emotional connection Americans felt to their president, elected, fallible, human, was alien to men raised under dictatorship. "They choose their leaders," one prisoner observed, "and then they care what happens to them." The simple democracy of it was overwhelming. Every 4 years, Americans could change their government without violence, without revolution, simply by voting. Leaders rose and fell based on persuasion rather than force. The system was chaotic, contentious, inefficient, and it worked better than anything the Reich had devised. Summer brought visitors to Camp Grant. Local church groups organized trips to bring American civilians to meet German prisoners, to humanize the enemy, to practice the Christian forgiveness they preached. The visits were voluntary on both sides. Prisoners who wished to participate could do so. Those who preferred isolation remained in barracks. Pabel went, partly from curiosity, partly from boredom, mostly from a growing desire to understand these people who had defeated him but refused to hate him. The American families brought food, homemade cakes, cookies, pies. They brought small gifts, books, playing cards, musical instruments. They sat at long tables in the recreation hall and attempted conversation through translators and gestures. The interactions were awkward, stilted, but genuine. An elderly woman from Rockford sat across from Pabel. She had white hair, kind eyes, hands wrinkled by years of work. Through the translator, she asked about his family, where he was from, what he did before the war. "I was student," Pabel said. "Before conscription, I wanted to be teacher." "My son wanted to be a teacher," the woman said. Her voice caught slightly. "He was killed at Normandy, June 6th. The date was recent. The invasion, the beginning of the end. Pabel did not know what to say. He had fought against Americans, had perhaps killed them. This woman's son might have died from German bullets, German shells, German resistance. "I am sorry," he managed. The woman nodded. "So am I. For all of us." She reached across the table and took his hand. Her grip was firm, her skin dry and warm. "My son died fighting your country, but I don't hate you. You're just a boy caught in this terrible thing, same as he was." Pabel felt something break inside his chest. Not the dramatic collapse of earlier revelations, but something quieter, more fundamental. This woman who had lost her son to Germans could still see him as human, could still extend compassion across the divide of nation and loss. How? "My mother in Germany," he said quietly. "She prays for me. She does not know if I am alive." "Then we'll pray for you together," the woman said. "Your mother and I, we want the same thing. For our boys to come home." The simple equation stunned him. His mother and this American mother both wanting the same thing, both suffering the same fear. The war had tried to make them enemies, but motherhood was older than war, deeper than nationalism. In the face of that biological imperative, protect the child, bring him home, ideology dissolved into irrelevance. Other prisoners had similar experiences. Men who expected hatred received kindness. Men who had fought Americans now ate pie with American families. Men who had been taught that Americans were racial mongrels discovered individuals. A farmer who loved baseball, a pastor who played violin, a teenager curious about German music. "They're not like us," one prisoner said afterward, trying to reconcile the experience with his assumptions. "No," Pabel replied. "They're exactly like us. That's the problem." If Americans were subhuman, their kindness meant nothing. If they were monsters, their restraint was illusion. But if they were simply people, complex, contradictory, individual, then everything the Reich had taught was false. The Jews were not parasites. The Slavs were not subhuman. The Americans were not mongrels. They were all simply people, exactly as human as Germans, exactly as worthy of dignity and life. And if that were true, what had the war been for? In May, as spring turned to early summer, news began filtering into the camp about the liberation of concentration camps. First Buchenwald, then Dachau, then Bergen-Belsen. The reports were fragmentary, censored by camp authorities, but the outlines were clear: mass death, systematic extermination, evidence of crimes that defied comprehension. The prisoners reacted with disbelief. Some called it propaganda, Allied lies designed to justify the war. Others fell silent, recognizing truth in the reports, even if they did not want to. Many argued that they had not known, that the Wehrmacht had fought honorably while other organizations committed atrocities. Pabel did not know what to believe. He had never seen a concentration camp. His war had been fought in Africa and Italy against soldiers with something resembling rules. But he remembered things, conversations overheard, officers making oblique references to special operations in Poland, the disappearance of Jewish businesses in Dusseldorf, his teachers explaining the necessity of racial hygiene, the burden of caring for life unworthy of life. He had not known the details, but he had known something. They had all known something. They had chosen not to ask questions, not to look too closely, to trust that their leaders were acting for Germany's good. This was the final wall to collapse. The comfortable fiction that they had been innocent soldiers fighting an honorable war, unconnected to the regime's crimes. They had all been connected. Every soldier who fought had freed resources for the camps. Every victory had prolonged the killing. Every man who served the Reich had made himself complicit in its actions. "What do we do with this?" a prisoner asked during a late-night discussion in the barracks. "How do we live with it?" No one had an answer. How did you live with the knowledge that you had served evil, that your courage had been in service to atrocity, that the nation you loved had committed crimes that would echo through centuries? Pabel lay on his bunk and stared at the ceiling. He thought about the American medics who had saved his life at Volturno. They had not asked whether he knew about the camps. They had not interrogated his political beliefs. They had simply treated his wounds and moved on to the next patient. They had separated the man from the regime, the individual from the ideology. Could he do the same? Could he separate the Germany he loved, the language, the culture, the landscape of his childhood, from the Germany that had built the camps? Could he remain German while rejecting National Socialism? Could he love his country while acknowledging its crimes? These were not questions with easy answers. They would take years to resolve, decades perhaps. But lying in an American prisoner of war camp, fed and clothed and treated with dignity by people who had every reason to hate him, Pabel understood that finding those answers was the work of his life now. The war might end, but the reckoning would continue. April 1945. The war was ending. Everyone knew it, though the official declarations had not yet come. Soviet forces were in Berlin. American troops were across the Rhine. Germany was being divided, occupied, ground into dust. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted exactly 12 years. At Camp Grant, the prisoners watched the news with mixed emotions: relief that the dying would stop, fear of what came next, dread of repatriation to a Germany that no longer existed, that had been bombed into rubble, that faced an uncertain future under occupation. The camp authorities began processing prisoners for return. Those fit for transport would be sent back as soon as logistics allowed. The Germans would be returned to Germany, or to what remained of it, to face whatever trials awaited, to rebuild from ruins, to explain to their children what they had done and why. Pabel received his processing papers in late April. He was scheduled for repatriation in June, 2 months to prepare for a return to a homeland he barely recognized. He could not do it. The realization came not as a dramatic revelation, but as a quiet certainty, building over months of observation and experience. He could not return to Germany. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. The Germany he had left no longer existed. The Germany that was emerging, divided, occupied, haunted by its crimes, was not a place he could imagine living, not because it would be difficult, though it would be, but because he had changed too much. He was no longer the young sergeant who had crawled toward American lines at Volturno. That man had believed in Aryan superiority, in German destiny, in the righteousness of the Reich. That man was dead, killed not by bullets, but by kindness, by evidence, by the slow accumulation of contradictions too numerous to ignore. The man who remained was something else, not quite American. He would never be that, could never fully shed his German identity, but not fully German either, not in the way the Reich had defined it. He was something in between, something undefined, a man without a country because his country had disappeared beneath the weight of its own lies. On April 27, 1945, Reinhold Pabel escaped from Camp Grant, not escaped in the traditional sense, through tunnels or daring raids. He simply walked away. During a work detail at a farm outside Rockford, he excused himself to use the latrine and kept walking, through fields, along back roads, away from the camp and toward Chicago, 90 kilometers to the south. The elderly guard did not notice his absence for an hour. By then, Pabel was miles away, moving through the Illinois countryside with no plan except to not return. He had no map, little money, no clear destination, but he had learned things in his 18 months as a prisoner. He had learned that Americans were not vigilant, not suspicious, that they assumed good faith rather than hostility. He had learned that with confidence in basic English, a man could move through this country unremarked. He had learned that in America, if you looked purposeful, people assumed you had purpose. He walked through that first day, staying to back roads, avoiding towns. When darkness fell, he slept in a barn, surrounded by the smell of hay and livestock, sounds that reminded him of Germany before the war. In the morning, he continued walking. On the second day, he reached the outskirts of Chicago. The city sprawled before him, vast and incomprehensible, a metropolis that dwarfed anything in Germany. He had no identity papers, no ration cards, no legal right to exist. He had only determination and a desperate desire to not return to a Germany that no longer felt like home. He found work quickly, manual labor, asking no questions, paying cash. Construction sites needed workers. Warehouses needed loaders. In post-war America, with so many men still overseas, employers were not particular about documentation. He gave his name as Philip Brick, a name he invented on the spot, trying to sound American, trying to disappear into the great anonymity of the city. He found a room in a boarding house, $6 a week, shared bathroom, no questions asked. He worked during the day, read voraciously at night, American novels, history, newspapers. He taught himself English properly, losing his accent through imitation and practice. He remade himself, not entirely but enough, becoming Philip Brick while keeping some part of Reinhold Pabel hidden beneath the surface. The war ended. Germany surrendered. The world began the long process of accounting for what had happened. And Pabel lived in Chicago, anonymous and free, working as a bookseller, writing occasional articles under pseudonyms, building a life that should not have been possible but somehow was. He did not forget what he had been, but he became something else as well, something the Reich had insisted was impossible, a German who rejected Germany, a soldier who chose peace, an enemy who learned to see his enemies as human. 8 years passed before Pabel turned himself in. 8 years of living as Philip Brick, working honestly, paying taxes, or at least payroll deductions, contributing to American society while technically being a fugitive and illegal immigrant. 8 years of watching from the margins as America built its post-war order, as Germany divided into East and West, as the Cold War replaced the Hot War. In 1953, Pabel walked into the office of the Immigration and Naturalization Service in Chicago and confessed. He was Reinhold Pabel, German prisoner of war, escaped from Camp Grant in April 1945. He had lived under a false identity. He had violated the terms of the Geneva Convention. He was, by any legal standard, a criminal. The INS agent stared at him. The confession was so unusual, so unnecessary, that they did not quite know how to process it. Men did not typically turn themselves in for crimes no one was investigating. "Why now?" one agent asked. Pabel had prepared for this question. "Because I want to stay," he said, "legally as myself. I want to become American, but I cannot do that while living a lie." The case made its way through bureaucratic channels. Technically, Pabel should have been deported. He had violated immigration law, had lived illegally for 8 years, had committed what amounted to desertion from prisoner status. But his case was unusual. He had not committed any crimes during his time as Philip Brick. He had worked, paid taxes, integrated into society. He had voluntarily surrendered when he could have continued living anonymously. The decision went up to the White House. President Eisenhower, himself a former general, reviewed the case personally. In August 1953, Eisenhower granted a full pardon. Reinhold Pabel was permitted to remain in the United States, to apply for legal residency, to begin the process of becoming an American citizen. The pardon came with conditions. Pabel would have to tell his story publicly to explain how an escaped German prisoner of war had lived in America for 8 years. The government wanted the story told as a demonstration of American generosity, as proof that even former enemies could find redemption in the American system. Pabel agreed. He wrote a book, Enemies Are Human, published in 1955. The title captured his central discovery, the simple truth that had transformed him from German soldier to American resident. Enemies were human. Not subhuman, not monsters, not abstractions to be destroyed. Human beings with families, hopes, fears, capable of kindness and cruelty in equal measure. The recognition of that shared humanity was not weakness, but the foundation of any decent civilization. The book sold modestly. Most Americans were more interested in forgetting the war than examining its philosophical implications. But some readers understood. Veterans who had fought in Europe recognized the truth in Pabel's descriptions. German Americans saw in his story a way to reconcile their heritage with their loyalty to America. And prisoners of war, men who had been captured, had experienced the same transformation Pabel described, wrote letters confirming every detail. "You told my story," one former POW wrote. "I could not have said it better." Pabel continued working as a bookseller. He wrote occasional articles for Time magazine under his own name now, essays about Germany, about the Cold War, about the necessity of international understanding. He married an American woman, had children who grew up knowing their father's complicated history. He became, in all the ways that mattered, American. But he never forgot what had made that transformation possible. He never forgot the American medics at Volturno who saved his life when they could have left him to die. He never forgot Captain Morrison, the surgeon from Cleveland who cared about a German prisoner's ability to walk. He never forgot the cake and oranges at Camp Grant, the American families who extended forgiveness, the ordinary kindness of people who refused to be defined by hatred. In interviews later in life, Pabel was often asked to explain his transformation. How did a convinced National Socialist become an American? What changed his mind? His answer was always the same. They treated me as human when I was their enemy. That is a power greater than any weapon. The story of Reinhold Pabel is not a story of conversion through argument or ideology defeated by superior ideology. It is a story of transformation through experience, of belief systems that could not withstand contact with contradicting reality. Pabel had been raised to believe in German superiority, taught that other peoples were less capable, less worthy. less human. These beliefs were not casual prejudices, but systematically constructed worldviews, reinforced by education, propaganda, law, and social pressure. To question them was to stand against an entire society, to mark oneself as disloyal or weak. The only force capable of breaking such systematic indoctrination was systematic counter-evidence. Not one piece of evidence, but many, accumulated over time, each one chipping away at the foundations until the structure collapsed. The evidence began at Volturno when American medics saved Pabel's life. It continued through his surgery, his recovery, his transport to America. It accumulated at Camp Grant in the daily experience of being treated with dignity. It crystallized in his interactions with American civilians who extended forgiveness. It reached completion with the revelation of concentration camp atrocities, which showed the true face of the ideology he had served. Each piece of evidence was specific, concrete, undeniable. Not abstract arguments about human rights or democracy, but cake and oranges, clean bandages and functioning antibiotics, farm families sharing pie with enemy soldiers. The simple, repeated experience of being treated well by people who had no obligation to treat him well. This is the power of humane treatment of prisoners, not as a reward for good behavior, but as an assertion of values. The Americans who treated German prisoners with dignity were not doing so because the Germans deserved it. They were doing so because they believed that all humans deserved it, regardless of the uniform they wore or the ideology they had served. This belief was costly. It required resources, food, medical care, guard details, administrative overhead that could have been used elsewhere. It required emotional labor, extending compassion to men who had killed Americans. It required faith that principles mattered even when following them was inconvenient. But the investment paid dividends. Of the 378,000 German prisoners of war held in the United States during World War II, few returned to Germany with positive feelings toward National Socialism. Most had undergone transformations similar to Pabel's, though less dramatic. They had seen American abundance and efficiency. They had been treated with respect. They had interacted with ordinary Americans and discovered individuals rather than stereotypes. When these men returned to Germany after the war, they became voices for democracy, for reconciliation, for rejecting the ideology that had led to catastrophe. They had been educated not through lectures, but through experience, not through argument, but through observation. They had learned that the promises of National Socialism were lies, not because someone told them so, but because they had seen the reality with their own eyes. This was America's secret weapon, not bombers or aircraft carriers, but the simple consistency of acting according to stated values. The Americans claimed to believe in human dignity, in the rule of law, in the Geneva Convention, and then they actually followed through. In a world where propaganda had become divorced from reality, where every nation claimed virtue while practicing cruelty, this consistency was revolutionary. The National Socialists had taught that strength meant ruthlessness, that mercy was weakness, that true power came from the willingness to be cruel. They had built a system based on terror, on the subordination of individual conscience to collective will, on the division of humanity into worthy and unworthy. And they had been defeated by a nation that rejected those principles. Not because America was perfect. It was not. Its own racial struggles and injustices would continue for decades, but because it had committed, however imperfectly, to a set of ideals that recognized basic human dignity. The contradiction between American ideals and American practice created space for criticism and reform. The National Socialists had eliminated that space, and in doing so, had eliminated the possibility of self-correction. Pabel's transformation was not unique. Across America, in camps from California to Maine, German prisoners were undergoing similar experiences. Some resisted, clinging to National Socialist beliefs through denial and rationalization. But many, perhaps most, found their worldviews eroded by daily contact with a reality that contradicted their training. They saw Black American soldiers serving with competence and courage, destroying racial theories. They saw Jewish refugees who had escaped Germany building successful lives in America, disproving claims of parasitism. They saw democracy functioning, messy and contentious, but ultimately effective. They saw a society that, for all its flaws, offered more opportunity and freedom than the Reich had ever provided. The lesson was clear. Humanity was not weakness. Diversity was not degeneration. Freedom was not chaos. These were not abstract political positions, but observable facts, verified through experience, impossible to deny except through willful blindness. Reinhold Pabel lived until 1993, dying at age 73 in the country that had once been his enemy. In his later years, he often spoke at schools and civic organizations, telling his story, explaining how he had been transformed from German soldier to American citizen. He never sugar-coated the history. He spoke honestly about his service in the Wehrmacht, about his belief in National Socialism, about his initial prejudices against Americans. He did not claim to have been secretly opposed to the Reich, did not pretend innocence. He had been a true believer, and that made his transformation more significant, not less. "I was taught to hate," he would tell audiences, "but I was shown kindness. That kindness saved me. Not just my life, but my soul. It gave me the chance to become someone different, someone better than I had been." The message resonated particularly with veterans. Men who had fought in World War II, in Korea, in Vietnam, understood the complexity of war, the way ideology simplified human beings into enemies, the difficulty of maintaining humanity in dehumanizing conditions. They recognized in Pabel's story a validation of their own choices to treat enemies with dignity, to follow rules even when doing so was costly. But Pabel's legacy extended beyond his own story. His experience became a case study in prisoner of war treatment, cited in military training, referenced in policy discussions. The United States' approach to German prisoners in World War II, humane treatment, adherence to the Geneva Convention, strategic use of captivity to undermine enemy ideology, became a model, however imperfectly followed, for later conflicts. The fundamental insight was this: how you treat enemies reveals who you are. Torture and cruelty may extract short-term information, but they also validate enemy propaganda, reinforce hostile beliefs, create martyrs and grievances that fuel future conflicts. Humane treatment, by contrast, undermines enemy ideology by demonstrating through action that their propaganda was false. This does not mean naive pacifism or refusal to fight. The Americans who captured Pabel had fought brutally to defeat the Wehrmacht. They had killed German soldiers, bombed German cities, accepted enormous casualties to destroy the Reich. They were not soft, but having won the battle, having taken prisoners, they chose to treat those prisoners according to principles that transcended military necessity. That choice changed Reinhold Pabel, and in changing him it demonstrated the power of values consistently applied, of ideals made real through action, of a nation that understood true strength lay not in cruelty, but in the courage to remain humane, even toward enemies. Picture Reinhold Pabel one last time, not as the old man he became, but as he was in September 1943, a wounded sergeant crawling through Italian dirt, leaving a trail of blood, expecting death. In that moment, he was the product of National Socialist education, a true believer in Aryan superiority, a soldier convinced that his enemies were racial inferiors who would show no mercy. Everything in his background, his training, his ideology, told him that surrendering to Americans meant torture, humiliation, or death. What happened next changed not only his life, but his understanding of what was possible. The American medics who saved him demonstrated that enemies could be human. The doctors who operated on him proved that professional ethics could transcend nationality. The nurses who cared for him showed that compassion was not limited by uniform or flag. Every day afterward reinforced those lessons. The food that kept him fed, the medical care that healed his wounds, the work that gave him dignity. the American families who extended forgiveness, the prisoners of war system that, however imperfect, maintained basic human decency in the midst of total war. Pabel could have rejected all this evidence. Many prisoners did, clinging to National Socialist beliefs through denial, claiming American kindness was a trick or propaganda. But Pabel allowed himself to be changed by what he experienced. He let the contradictions accumulate until they could no longer be denied. He chose truth over comfort, reality over ideology. That choice, to see clearly, to acknowledge error, to embrace transformation, required courage. Not the physical courage of battle, though Pabel had proven that in Africa and Italy, but the moral courage to admit you were wrong, that your life had been built on lies, that the enemy you had fought to kill were more humane than the regime you had served. The crater where Pabel was wounded has long since been filled, the battlefield reclaimed by farmers or turned into monument. No marker identifies the spot where a German sergeant lay bleeding, making a choice that would define the rest of his life. But the significance of that moment extends far beyond one man's decision to crawl toward enemy lines. It speaks to the power of humane treatment to transform enemies into friends. It demonstrates that values matter, that principles applied consistently can change hearts and minds more effectively than any propaganda. It proves that even in war, especially in war, maintaining our humanity is not weakness, but strength. Reinhold Pabel expected to die in that crater. Instead, he discovered that enemies were human. That simple discovery, revolutionary in its implications, obvious in retrospect, saved his life and changed his world. The question his story poses to every generation is this: how will we treat those we have defeated? Will we respond with cruelty, validating their propaganda, confirming their worst beliefs about us? Or will we respond with justice tempered by mercy, demonstrating through our actions who we claim to be? Pabel's transformation suggests that the second path, however difficult, is not only morally right, but strategically wise, that the truest victory comes not from destroying enemies, but from showing them a better way. That the most powerful weapon is not force, but the courage to live according to principles even when doing so is costly. In 1943, a German sergeant crawled toward American lines, expecting death. He found instead something more powerful than any ideology, more transformative than any propaganda. He found human kindness extended across the divide of war. And in that kindness, he found the possibility of redemption. That is the lesson of Reinhold Pabel. That is the power of treating enemies as human. That is the strength of a nation that dares to live by its stated values, even in the crucible of total war. The crater is gone. The battlefield is quiet. But the lesson endures. Humanity consistently practiced is stronger than hate. Always has been, always will be.